Welcome to the Good and Basic Podcast, a long-form conversation between Joseph and Joseph. Today, we are going to be having basically a good conversation about brokenism. What is brokenism? Are other Joseph and I brokenists, or are we something else? What is the status of the institutions of our world and our society, and what, if anything, should be done about it? Before we get to that subject, though, let's have just a brief update, since it's been a while since either Joseph or I have posted a podcast episode about what we're up to and what we've got going on. Welcome, Joseph. Do you want to go first with that?
You betcha. So since last we met, which, when was that? That was probably almost a year ago.
Has been a hot minute.
It has been a hot minute. I've been thinking many philosophical thoughts which need to be turned into videos. I have moved twice. I've started a business making 3D printed spinning wheels. That business has grown to the point where it's a pretty substantial supplemental income, which has been really, really deeply appreciated, because in the gap when I lost my job with Monticello College, that's what provided for my family for a year and a half. Since then, I've moved to Missouri, and my wife and I have started a homestead. We're starting to put in gardens and starting to imagine things like greenhouses and solar panels on the roof in the not too distant future. So lots of good and basic projects coming out of that. Basically, I'm trying to ease my way back into making videos. How about you?
I was just going to comment real fast. So essentially nothing, right? Just like a couple of moves, a couple of businesses, a couple of, I won't say career changes, but job changes. Almost nothing.
Yes, I passed the bar.
Yeah, congratulations. I already knew that, but that's interesting news probably for our listeners, that Joseph passed the bar, so now he can practice law.
Yeah.
Pretty exciting. So from my end, about a year ago, I started working at about the same time. No, it would have been shortly before you moved, right?
Okay.
I started working for a civil litigation firm in Salt Lake City, Utah. It's been A, difficult, B, rewarding, and those two words pretty much describe everything about it for me. So that's the story of my life at the moment. Probably a lot more that could be said, and a lot of interesting thoughts, right? I mean, you know this very well. Law is an area, it's a profession and a field of study that engenders a lot of thoughts and questions, a lot of social questions, a lot of questions about ethics, a lot of questions about what it means to be a professional, a lot of questions about adversarial relationships and how to navigate those, things like that. So lots of interesting stuff, which, much like your homesteading, almost none of which we will get today, because instead we're talking about brokenism.
We have to start somewhere. I think we'll get to all of those things eventually. The psychology elements, the orienting goals, the philosophy, the social stuff. Like there's a lot of really juicy topics to cover. And when we're not posting videos, it's not like we're not doing anything. A lot of these videos that we end up making are digested subconsciously for a very long time before they're ready to be released in a video form. So you and I have had conversations about a number of topics related to law firm practice and also current events and things that are going on that I think have some real potential to be turned into material for the Good and Basic channel and also for this podcast.
Agreed. Without further ado, shall we jump into brokenism?
Yes. What is this brokenism thing, and are we brokenists?
Yeah. So the sort of the precipitation for this conversation was a podcast episode and an article that I read that I'll post in the show notes about brokenism. Brokenism is a word that many people probably have not heard of, and so it spurred the question for me, right? Like, are you and I brokenists? So what brokenism is, or what this idea of brokenism is, if I understand correctly, is that the main social, cultural / political divide in the United States specifically, but perhaps worldwide too, today is not between Democrats and Republicans, or conservatives and liberals, or between the religious and the a-religious. Instead, the divide, or between working class and white collar, instead the fundamental divide is between brokenists and status-quoists. And the journalist who writes about this tells a story about a conversation she had with somebody, a reader of hers, who said, "I'm not sure what I believe anymore. I'm not sure where I fall on the political spectrum. What I do know is that I believe that the institutions and structures of our society today are fundamentally broken." So if you are a brokenist, excuse me, if you are a brokenist, if I understand correctly, you are somebody who believes that the institutions of our society are fundamentally flawed and damaged. And if you are a status quoist, then you are somebody who believes that they are not fundamentally flawed and damaged, even if they do have flaws and damage. You believe, if you are a status quoist, that the harms are, or that, that the damages, that the flaws are essentially repairable, and probably that they're essentially repairable from within the system. By way of analogy, this is an analogy that this journalist uses. I'll mention her name too. Her name is Alana Newhouse, and she writes for Tablet Magazine. I believe she's actually one of the editors at Tablet Magazine. So one of the analogies that she uses in the podcast episode that I listened to is if you lived in a house or any building, right? Let's say you're leasing some kind of building from someone. There might be problems with the building. If you are if you are a status quoist, you see problems in the building, but you think, my property manager can probably sort these out. They're not, fundamental. You might use the word systemic flaws. If you are a broken, and so therefore you can continue to live in that building and work in that building even while you go on fixing it. If you are a brokenist, then you are somebody who believes that the building is about to collapse at any moment. And so you can't stay inside the building and continue to work at it, to continue to work at fixing it and sort of progressively and incrementally repairing it. Instead, you need to get out of the building now. And the building probably needs to be condemned, demolished, replaced. It's not about fixing it from the inside. It's about tearing everything down, burning everything down, and sort of starting anew. As a few concrete examples that have come to me, it seems to me, and Joseph, we talked about this very briefly, that court systems are probably status quoists. They really don't like radical change. By contrast, for instance, Trump voters in 2016 who believed that this was a Flight 93 election, where if Hillary Clinton was elected, that would be just so catastrophically disastrous for the United States that any means would be justified to get Trump elected. They're probably brokenists, not status quoists. Let's see what. Sorry, I'm pulling up my list, but maybe you want to chip in with possible brokenists or status quoists in society today. Oh, one I was going to mention is homeschoolers are probably brokenists, right? They tend to look at public schools and say, this is bad enough or flawed enough that I can't even stay inside it. I can't even sort of see the good in it or take advantage of the good in it. I need to get out, and my best option is outside the system. So homeschoolists, I think, tend to be brokenists.
I think that one is a particularly good example, and that one's worth unpacking a little bit. As you're describing the difference between, sorry, what'd you say?
Oh, why don't we start there? Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds good. With homeschool in particular, the balance of incentives is really odd, because if you are homeschooling, you're saying, yes, I'm getting taxed. Let's assume that you are paying property taxes that contribute to local public education. You're saying, yes, I'm going to get taxed, and I'm going to accept that I'm going to get taxed, but I'm not going to get any of the benefits from it. I'm not going to accept the 8 hours of free childcare per day. I am not going to accept the free sports resources. I'm not going to accept music lessons. I'm not going to accept the opportunity for my kids to play with all these other kids during all that time. You're saying no to all of those opportunities because fundamentally you think that it is more valuable to educate your children at home than it is to take advantage of all of those things. And my personal position on homeschool is a little bit of fence setting. I personally was homeschooled for much of my education. Between the ages of, between first grade and about 10th grade, I was homeschooled. And I got a lot out of it. It was particularly valuable for me just because my initial experiences with school were not very positive. And also, my mother was kind of ridiculously overqualified, and so was able to provide a lot at home. However, in my own raising of my children, we've bounced back and forth. My wife and I have had this conversation numerous times, and our position has always been we view the public education system as a resource, and a resource that is frequently worth using. I've placed 2 of my children in school for a number of years, and that including bouncing around and moving as often as we have. I've had them in 3 different elementary schools, and the level of involvement and the level of trust I have placed in each school has varied quite a bit. Right now, based off of my children's personalities and where they're at, we've decided to pull my 2 older children out of public school for the moment and try homeschooling for the rest of this year to try to give them more of what they need emotionally and also to try to accelerate their learning in terms of reading and math. But that example of homeschool, because you're foregoing so much by homeschooling, is a really good example. It's let's get outside the system entirely and do our own thing separately, because we don't think that we can get what is needed just by talking with the teachers or working with the parent-teacher organizations or any of that stuff. I'm not going to try to reform it. I'm not going to try to work with it. I'm just going to get out now. And that's not quite as extreme as some of the versions of brokenism that I think we're going to talk about, which can get quite revolutionary and say, you know what, just burn the whole thing down. Or maybe not actively burn it down, but kind of anticipate with some mixture of horror or glee for the thing to naturally fall down, as you were mentioning. But it's a good starting point. I think the one way of interpreting the 2020 election is to say that the status-quoists, those who wanted a return to an old normal, wanted to get away from this idea of brokenism. And it's anyone's guess whether they were successful.
Yeah, I think, I'm thinking lots of things in response to what you said. First of all, just very briefly, that I think that's probably largely correct about the 2020 election, that Biden did present himself as a defender of institutions, right, and therefore a status quoist. And it's a separate question whether or not he really is, but that certainly seemed to be its pitch.
Certainly, even within the party.
Conversely, you and I have talked about, and I think it's a very profound and correct point, that an enormous part of Trump's appeal and an enormous part of his pitch is that he's a brokenist. He believes and attracts as supporters those who believe that there's something deeply flawed about the institution, such that you need an outsider, you need a non-career politician in order to fix things. But more to what you were saying about homeschooling, would it be fair to say then that you are a pro homeschool, or you like homeschooling, but not exclusively because you're a brokenist? I don't know. Do you consider yourself a brokenist regarding schooling?
To be, for sure. I mean, during times, partially when I was homeschooled myself, and when I attended Paradigm High School, and even when I taught at Paradigm High School, I was much more likely to throw the baby out with the bathwater and to say the system is broken. It was developed to make perfect little cogs in a factory machine, blah, 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 and to look at curriculum as thinly veiled political indoctrination, and to basically say that the whole system is so corrupt that I just want to get away from it and watch it collapse from the outside. So 100% the brokenist frame. My position right now is most people are trying to do a good job, and most systems are far less important than the culture of the people in them. Any system can become corrupted. Any system can become redeemed by the culture of the people that are, giving their all. So your teacher probably matters more than your school, and your school probably matters more than your school system, if that makes sense.
To me, that makes perfect sense, and I 100% agree. Right, and I noticed that as you establish that chain, you're moving upwards in levels of abstraction and generality. Right, if you have a good teacher in a public school system, you can still get a lot of good stuff done. right? I don't know if this quote comes, it comes from a family member of yours, I believe, or at least that's where I first heard it, that crooked sticks can draw straight lines, right?
Yes.
And that's a thing worth knowing. And I think that's correct. And I think that means, I mean, one question, does that make us, you and me, brokenists? Because a brokenist thinks that the building is about to collapse. Whereas you and I share your opinion on this with school systems. I don't have kids, but if I had kids, I believe this would be my attitude, is I would be very open to trying to figure out, I would both be very open to taking advantage of the school system in terms of finding the benefits that it can offer, but also very prepared to step out of it, very prepared to say, look, we can go our separate ways. You can't meet my needs anymore. And I will ensure above all that you, the public school system, are either meeting my needs or not in my life.
There's a real difficulty in maintaining that. I'm going to be a devil's advocate against my own position and also against the one that you just articulated for just a moment. Because in order to do that, in order to be in a position where you can opt out at a moment's notice, or even not at a moment's notice, but within short notice, you can say, this is no longer working and I'm going to move to an alternative. It requires an awful lot of you. Not only in the monitoring, because you have to be aware enough of what is going on in the school, using that as an example. You need to be watching it, and you need to be watching it with a mixture of trust and distrust. It's kind of that classic trust but verify thing that they used during the Cold War, where you are willing to give the benefit of the doubt, but you're also checking the receipts. So that is a level of brain power that you have to bring to the problem. And also there's an economic component to this as well, where the sacrifices that are involved to homeschool are enormous in terms of your time and energy and effort. And that is time and energy and effort that you are necessarily not spending on something else, like working. In order to homeschool, one of the things that my wife and I have discovered repeatedly, she has worked from home as an editor and book editor and as a freelance writer, and also as an adjunct professor. My wife is one smart cookie. And trying to balance teaching kids at home and doing those other work activities is almost impossible. We've done it before. I've tried to support her as possible so that she had time at home to do those things, and we balanced our work schedules. We found ways to make it happen, but the sacrifice was enormous. So to be in this position where you have kind of 1 foot in the brokenist camp and 1 foot in the I'm going to trust the system camp is actually very, very challenging to accomplish. And perhaps that challenge, those costs are maybe prohibitive for some people. I don't know.
So one of the reactions that I had to learning about this idea of brokenism versus status quoism, and that I heard the author of the article explore briefly, she proposed, well, maybe there's Tinkerists too. And in other words, people who are perhaps more, if I understand correctly, this is what it would mean to me, is people who are much more actively involved in remodeling the building, right? And they think that the building needs quite a bit of remodeling, perhaps, or it needs a very active effort to remodel, but they're still inside the building, right? And so it made me think, well, I don't know, is brokenism versus status quoism, is this just a very, very long gray-dated spectrum, right? Like, for instance, maybe you think one part of the building is safe to live in, or you think, well, the building is safe to live in, but only if measures X, Y, and Z are taken, right? It just seems to me that if the ultimate in status quoism is, is the dog in the burning house, right? Everything is fine, this is fine. And then the ultimate in brokenism is running out of the building and throwing a match behind you to burn the whole thing. Like, it just seems to me that there's a lot of gradations along that scale, right? And for instance, you're kind of doing that. Well, I don't know. I was going to say you're kind of doing that because you move your kids in and out of public schools, right? But it seems to me that that's more switchy between brokenism and status quoism, whereas a tinkerist would say, I'm going to participate in the system and try to make it so that my efforts positively reform or sustain the system, which leads me into another sort of thing that I think about this too is that, like, there's an idea, and I can't tell if this is an idea that people have until they become more mature. Like, I don't know if it's just a question of age, or if it's, or if it seems to me it might largely be a question of age. When you're young, you see the institutions around you, and they just sort of sustain you without any effort, or stymie you without any effort, right? I don't have, to take the school example. If I'm going to public school as a young teenager, I don't have to do anything to make the school system run. I am either the beneficiary or the victim of the system. I in no way or no substantial way do I sustain it or support it or participate meaningfully in it, perhaps, right? I'm not paying taxes. I don't write the lesson plans. I don't have to do any of the administrative stuff. But as you get older and you're integrated into the systems and institutions of society, well, you do start paying taxes and you do start doing administrative things. And if you're a teacher, you do lesson plans. And whatever your job is, you start, you in some sense become a status-quoist naturally, in the sense that you're participating in sustaining the institutions and systems around you. And so part of me thinks, like, is the problem that we, or part of the difficulty here is that the systems and institutions that we inhabit actually do require our participation, right? Like, in order to be sustained, in order to survive, right? Like, if you don't pay taxes and if the IRS doesn't come after you, there is no tax system, right? If you don't go to work and if your employer doesn't pay you, well, there is no employment relationship, right? It actually does require sustaining efforts from the people who participate in it. I can't remember where I was going with this, so I'll let you jump off on it. But it just seems to me that there's probably a spectrum between status-quoists and brokenists, and B, it isn't clear to me if a tinkerist, someone in the middle, is somebody who skips between them or somebody who is a status-quoist but actively works on reforming things, right? Does that make sense? And what do you think of that?
Certainly. I think the component of maturity is very, very, very important to this question. I had an exchange with one of my students when I taught high school. I was a high school science teacher for a year and really got a lot out of it. But I had one student who was recalcitrant and frustrated and kind of cranky at the system, and he was very prone to being kind of a revolutionary and quite mad at how the system worked and thinking that it was all dumb and easy to game. And he was expressing that in my class, and I was a little bit frustrated with him, and I said, I'm going to use a name that's not his. I said, John, I get where you're coming from. I actually do, because when I was your age, I thought exactly the same thing. And he said, oh yeah? What made the difference? And I said, maybe you should think about that, because if I thought the way you think now, and now I think the way I do, then maybe there's something in the system that's worth redeeming. Because I really did think all the things that you're thinking. Basically, I was trying to highlight to him that maybe I could see something that he couldn't because I also saw what he saw, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And it rings very true to me because I would say that when I was younger, my brokenist instincts were much stronger, right? And that now my status-quoist instincts are comparatively quite a bit stronger than they used to be. And
this is one reason why we want old judges.
Go ahead.
I just as a purely practical that's why we want judges to be old, or why the kind of archetypical image of a judge is old, is hopefully the maturity and stability that come with age. To say, okay, you've seen a lot of things that don't work, so hopefully you are appropriately calibrated for things that are good and new versus things that are terrible ideas that are just new and kind of popular at the moment. And your ability to ride that out appropriately and make changes, but do so in a sensible and orderly fashion is going to help keep the system running.
Yeah, well, and you do wonder, right? The young will always, right, just like your student did, the young will always accuse the old of being sellouts, right? Um, and I mean, this is kind of the stereotype of like the young college communist who has never paid taxes and knows nothing about the world, but definitely knows how to reorganize all of society and definitely knows how everything should be run, right? And there is a way in which like. And so the young, the young college communists will always look at older people who have integrated themselves into the institutions and systems of the world and say, well, you're a sellout, you're a hack, you're a hypocrite. But
never trust anyone over the age of 30.
Yeah, but I think you and I both think that that's wrong, and that one of the ways that that's wrong is because the young have had the the old have had the experiences that the young have had, but the young have not had the experiences that the old have had. I mean, you could still believe that the old are all sellouts, and for instance, politically, this is a very popular belief, and you see it on both the left and the right. If you're on the left, you're going to love, or I shouldn't say you will, right? But many people on the left love a younger generation of Democrats like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who do seem to me to be a little bit more along the brokenist. They're broken. They think that things are broken. Whereas when you think of older Democrats, you think of people like Chuck Schumer, who seem to be much, or Nancy Pelosi, who are much closer than Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is to the side of status-quoists, right? Like, let's work through the system. Let's live in the building as we repair it. Let's not tear everything down. And the same thing is true on the right. It's so interesting to me that, many people on the right, sort of the populist brand or the libertarian brand or the Trump brand of Republicans, they hate McConnell. They hate Mitch McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, even though he played a significant role in delivering 3 Supreme Court justice picks for Trump, right? And therefore for Republicans. But they hate him. And they hate him, I think, because they feel like he's a status quoist and a sellout, right? This is where Rhino and Dino come from, right? Those same classes of Republicans hated John McCain because of their perception that he was a rhino, right? And you see a similar dynamic, obviously, like on the left, as I described. And so that also makes me wonder, right? Is this proposed distinction between Brokenists and status-quoists, is it just a distinction between centrists and radicals? And it seems to me that there's a substantial amount of overlap there. A centrist is somebody who thinks that things are mostly okay, and therefore, even if work needs to be done, and they probably do think that at least some reparative work needs to be done, it can be done, right? It's not an emergency. It's not a house on fire type thing. Whereas I find that radicals on both the left and right, I'm not using that as a pejorative here. I'm using it as a descriptive term, right? Those who are radical on the left and right both feel that every election is a Flight 93 election, that, my goodness, if Biden wins in 2024, it's going to be the end of the world. Or if Trump wins in 2024, it's going to be the end of the world. So yeah, I don't know. I wonder, is brokenism and status quoism, just at least in the political sphere, just another way of saying centrist or radical?
Particularly like the term centrist, especially when it's applied to politics, because politics is actually quite complicated. The farthest right party in America right now, roughly speaking, are the libertarians. And if you break them down politically, they're about as far left as you can go, at least in terms of espousing an old classical liberal philosophy with a little bit of anarchism thrown in. One thing that I find really interesting, and this is an idea that I've stolen from HEMA, Historical European Martial Arts, is the idea that the center moves. So in fencing, there's an idea that whoever controls the center, which is the imaginary midpoint between the two people, whoever's blade controls that spot is winning the exchange and is about to deliver the final blow. But that center point moves if either of the players move. So if you take over the center and now have control of that, if I take a step to the right, the center moved, which means you no longer have control of the center. So as the left wing or the right wing shifts in American politics, where the center point is, and I still don't like that term because of how complicated political philosophy is, but it moves. It moves a lot. So anyone who holds still to a given set of convictions in politics is going to be accused of being a sellout eventually as their own party moves around them. Classic example of that from the current moment is Bill Maher. Bill Maher has been a classic kind of libertine left-winger for forever. He's been pretty much an absolutist on free speech. He's maintained the right to have a foul mouth and to say whatever he wants. He's been all for decriminalizing weed, and there's a lot of positions that he has had that are now considered passé on his own party, and other ones that are now becoming mainstream where he used to be the radical. His positions have not changed that much, if at all. So that's one thing I'd like to throw out, the centrist thing. One other framing that I still don't like entirely, but I think it matches on to this brokenist versus non-brokenist or status quoist thing better, is reformers and revolutionaries. Revolutionaries want to change the foundations. Reformers want to change what's built on top of them. And you see this with discussions that we're currently having in America, at least, about constitutional amendments and about things as fundamental as how many Supreme Court justices there are, and whether or not we're going to have a filibuster, and whether or not we're going to have an electoral college. A lot of this stuff is really fundamental stuff. And the fact that we're having discussions about foundations rather than what's built on top of them, more mundane stuff like Senate rules, although I guess, filibuster kind of fits in there. I think that's really where the discussion is. Where does the change need to happen? Is it in the foundations or is it further up?
Yeah, it's also, so I agree. And it seems to me that maybe in your language, or in what you've just described, a reformer is a tinkerist and a revolutionary is a brokenist, or something close to that.
Yeah.
And one interesting ambiguity there, and I think it's part of why these discussions are so difficult for us to have as a society. And I really do mean that, right? Like they're genuinely difficult. I mean, it's hard for you and I to talk about it, and it's even harder for society to talk about it, and to talk about it well. Is that it's not totally clear what the foundation is at any given point. That's an open question that itself can be part of the subject of discussion, right? So, for instance, we have this discussion in the United States, right? If you are 1619 Project adjacent, then you believe that the foundation of the country is racism. If you are something like a libertarian, then you probably are much more likely to believe that the foundations of the country are in Enlightenment liberalism. Right, and so it's not just about whether or not to rip out the foundations. It's like, wait, what is the foundation, right? And sort of by analogy to a building, it's not just, well, hang on, how much do we have to repair here? Do we have to rip out the foundation, rebuild the foundation? It's like, well, wait a second, is the foundation the concrete footings, or is the soil in the area compromised in a way that we actually need to build somewhere else? Another analogy that illustrates this in a slightly different way is I thought of caterpillars and butterflies, right? So is the transformation from a caterpillar to a butterfly, is it a fulfillment of the foundation of the butterfly, or is it fundamentally a revolutionary and transformative sort of action? Right? And the answer is, well, I don't know. It's not clear, right? You could make an argument for both sides. I think what's correct to say about that is that, it's part of the nature of a caterpillar to become a butterfly. And so it's more of a reformist thing instead of a revolutionary thing, right? But certainly if you look at the caterpillar and you look at the butterfly, they're such radically different creatures, or at least such seemingly radically different creatures, that it would be easy to think that that's a revolutionary change, right? And so if you don't understand what it is that you're coming from well, or if there's a lot of ambiguity or confusion about where it is that you're coming from and what the foundation is, I think it becomes very difficult to figure out, well, wait a second, am I a brokenist / revolutionary, or am I a tinkerer / reformer, or am I a status quoist? Because, for instance, to take, for instance, because I raised the 1619 Project, the question of race, you could say from a brokenist perspective, oh my goodness, right? The entire West is founded on racism. Not only do we have to throw out, modern institutions, but we have to throw out the U.S. Constitution. We have to throw out all of Western liberalism, the last 400 or 500 years of Western history, maybe even longer, maybe even all the way back to ancient Greece. It's all garbage, right? Or, for instance, if you're a reformer, you could say, well, no, there was there was a vein of racism that ran through the West, or perhaps only through or not only, but most significantly through the United States. But the foundation is the foundation of the country in terms of the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, the Constitution, and the ideals of Western liberalism. Well, no, like the foundation is fine. We can fix all this in sort of a progressive, ameliorative way. Or you could even be a status quoist and say, well, wait a second, like not only can we fix it, we are fixing it, and we have been in the process of fixing it, right? The Civil War and the 14th Amendment, you could say, made good upon the unfulfilled promises of the Declaration and the Constitution, which were further fulfilled and made good through the civil rights movement, you could say, and still in some modality are being fulfilled today, right? And so the weird thing is that, like, I think you could be depending on what you think the foundation is, you could be a Brokenist / revolutionary, a Tinkerist / reformer, or a status quoist. And because you could be you could reasonably be all three of them in some sense, until you resolve that basic question about what the foundational substrata of your societal systems are.
Yes, I think that the question is one of framing, and I'm not sure exactly how to articulate that. I've been very frustrated in the past. I really like an author named E.F. Schumacher, and E.F. Schumacher is an economist, and he wrote a book that I think is absolutely brilliant, and that book is called Small is Beautiful, Economics as if People Mattered. And he was kind of a key thinker in the appropriate technology movement, which has been the inspiration for an awful lot of the projects on the channel. Now, he wrote that book, and it's brilliant, and it's really a series of essays, and kind of, in some of them he whines about current things that are happening in economics, and some of them he has poignant things to say about fossil fuels, and other ones he has poignant things to say about development in the industrializing nations. So there's a lot of good stuff in there. He also wrote a book called A Guide for the Perplexed, where he tried to diagnose what was going wrong with society. I don't like that one as much. It feels like, Mr. Schumacher, I agree with you. There's something off. There's something off. It's hard to tell if we are experiencing change can either be progress or it can be corruption. And we can both say that it's change, and maybe there's a little bit of corruption mixed in with the progress and progress mixed in with the corruption, maybe. And, you might have a gut level feeling that there's something off in the society at large. When you try to articulate that, it runs into kind of the ancient Chinese Dao Ke Dao Fei Cheng Dao thing, where the way that can be named is not the true way. The name that can be named is not the true name, and you miss. There's something off in your diagnosis of the problem in society. The same thing happened when I read another book by a gentleman named Ralph Borsodi. I love his book. This is my favorite book on earth, probably, barring a couple of books of scripture. And this book is called The Flight from the City. And in this one, Mr. Borsodi gives a microcosm of what he is doing to become more economically self-sufficient and live a healthier, happier, holier life by living on a homestead with his family. And it's a really, really good book, very articulate, and he says some very poignant things about society at large. He wrote that book as a response, or like a little expansion on a Here's What's Wrong with Society book, just like Mr. Schumacher's. And that one was called This Ugly Civilization. And This Ugly Civilization, I can really get behind like 30% of it. And then the rest of it, I'm like, you're missing. You're fundamentally misunderstanding humanity and a few other things that make it so that your diagnosis of what's wrong with the world is off. Framing these problems and trying to say what the foundations of the society are in the first place is really, really challenging. And so I have not found yet a book on here's what's wrong with society that I haven't come away with a strong feeling of that you're missing something. Like you're just off by enough that I'm not sure that this book is really useful, other than the key, these ancillary ideas here and there that are more brilliant than the main idea, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I don't know if this is responding directly to what you said, or if it answers your question, right? Like, what is off about those those kinds of books or statements or arguments. But I also, when I hear those, find something off and wrong about them. And in fact, when I go back and reread some of the things that I wrote when I was a teenager, I'm like, oh, wow, this is off. And for the same reasons. Things that I wrote when I was a teenager that were much more brokenist and much more, let's say, revolutionary. And so I don't know if this is what you're perceiving. But one of the things that I perceive in those that I find, and this is probably pretty close to my deepest thoughts and feelings about whether or not I'm a brokenist or a status quoist or what I am, is that when we criticize, we put ourselves outside of something, or at least typically that's the posture, right? And it's very easy, or comparatively very easy, to stand outside something and explain everything that's wrong about it. What is much, much, much harder is to live and act well. And so in these revolutionary or sweepingly critical statements or manifestos, one of the things that I find wrong is that the writers seem to be placing themselves outside of the system and therefore outside of the problem, right? And that seems to me to be the fundamental instinct, let's say, perhaps, of brokenism, right? To use the building analogy, it's to get out of the building, right? I am outside the building, right? I divest myself, I separate myself. I no longer have anything to do with it, and it no longer has anything to do with me. But I think there's something fundamentally wrong with that instinct, because we are part of the world. And to place yourself outside of those systems, I think, tends to, I don't believe this 100%, but I think it's substantially true, tends to deprive ourselves of autonomy and power and responsibility for fixing things, right? Like I said earlier, systems are sustained by individual actions and behaviors. And so when I hear a manifesto that's like, well, the problem is just the system, we should burn it down, I'm like, okay, even if that's true, what makes you so sure that you can build something better, right? You've told me all about the problems with the system. You haven't assessed your own capabilities yet. What are your capabilities? Are you smart enough to build something better? Are you good enough to build something better? And one of the ways we might answer that question is, how are you acting inside of the systems that you already have? To go to your student that you referred to earlier, right? Your punk rebel student, right? Like, maybe he's right that public school curricula are just thinly veiled political propaganda, and that the man is out to get him and all that stuff. But it's like, okay, what's your solution to that problem? Like, just because you can criticize something doesn't mean that you're smart enough to replace it. And that's why I think sort of the Tinkerist instinct is think better. Because it assigns responsibility to the individual and says, okay, but what are you going to do, other than running out the door and tossing a match behind you to light everything on flames? Yeah, and I think, I don't know, as I think about whether or not I guess I'm a Tinkerist. I just find something wrong with the instinct that says the problem is outside of me. Not that that's always wrong.
I think there is a lot of wisdom in that. One way that we've articulated a similar idea, if not the same idea, is the Kevlar cow. And imagining a cow that's going through the meat grinder, which in this case is the corrupt system that's out to get him.
You're reading my mind. You're reading my mind.
A thinly veiled analogy for education system, which is trying to create cookie cutter. It's not interested in you as an individual. It's interested in you as product. Oh my gosh, how dehumanizing, how horrible. It's just like a cow going into the meat grinder.
Yeah.
And we were imagining putting on, a Kevlar vest as a cow, not trying to mess the system up, not trying to attack the system, not trying to run away from the system, but go through it in such a way that you aren't mangled by it, not corrupted by it, but able to hopefully take whatever good there is. And, there you have to kind of stretch the idea of a meat grinder pretty far. My wife has always thought that analogy is dumb, and that frustrated me to no end because I, with my brokenist instincts, would be very frustrated with various systems, particularly school, and say, I'm just going there to get a piece of paper. Why do I need this certification? Why is this class required? Why am I being required to do things? Why is there so much force and compulsion being used? And I would just get so frustrated. And my wife is very intelligent, but also seems to effortlessly be able to navigate this sort of thing and work within systems without feeling corrupted or owned by them. Where my susceptibility to feeling corrupted or owned by a system is a lot higher, at least naturally. And so I've had to pay attention and learn from her example, which I used to find incredibly frustrating. I was like, so are you a sap just getting sucked in? No. Actually, you do have your independence, lots and lots of it. So have you been corrupted by it? No, you're still... I mean, what's going on here? And why aren't you as emotionally invested in this thing being wrong? And I think the foundations of our culture are not ideas, and I don't think that they're history. Margaret Thatcher famously said that Europe is built on a foundation of history and America is built on a foundation of philosophy. I don't think either one of those is correct. I think what we're built on is morality, habits. And I do not think that collective groups have any morality at all. I don't think that's a thing. I think that it's aggregate of individuals. So we need to, play nice with the other kids. And that makes it really, really hard to affect any sort of lasting change because you can never, ever, ever do it from the top. It just does not work. There's no central point where you can just make everybody better. The Soviets desperately wanted to create a new man that was altruistic and able to, work for the good of the many. And they tried to create that morality in individuals through top-down force. Did not work. The only thing that seems to work is small-scale, almost one-on-one preaching and ministering. It doesn't necessarily have to always be religious. I mean, clearly societies can function reasonably well without that. But one-on-one, we hold each other to account and encourage each other to be better. And that is literally the only thing that holds societies together. And I think if there is a certain level of societal corruption where enough individuals, like a critical mass of individuals, are just not living up to their higher selves and are, when we talk about the rancor in politics and the norms of language that are being allowed, where there's so much incendiary language being used, I used to look at that and say, yeah, but look at what the other guys are doing, and yeah, but it's just words. And I'm starting to think more and more that these little things, the ways that we treat individuals, that is the problem. That is the fundamental issue. And you cannot fix it. No individual can fix it. But you can at least make it not worse. And if enough people make it not worse, then that is the definition of it being fixed.
Yeah, I also want to qualifying my earlier statement, and this also speaks to what you just said. I'm qualifying my earlier statement. I don't think it's always like sometimes, I mean, there are such things as buildings that need to be condemned, right? For instance, the West did that with Nazi Germany, and that was, probably one, it certainly has turned out better than the immediate alternative, right? Of leaving Nazi Germany there. Right, that was a building that we fumigated. And we did something similar to Japan. And it seems like Germany and Japan are probably better for that. Certainly seems that way. Right. And even in a literal sense, right, like sometimes buildings are condemned and they need to be knocked down. I guess it's the fundamental instinct. I don't have a problem with assigning blame to outside oneself. I do have a problem with only assigning blame outside oneself. There has to be some share of personal responsibility. And I guess my concern with brokenism is that it's unclear to me if people who have strong brokenist instincts are properly accounting for their own sense of responsibility. So I guess that sort of speaks to what you're saying, right? That I also believe that it's fundamentally the work of many, many, many individuals or small groups of people, at least as much and probably more so than top-down approaches. But I do want to leave some space for fumigating buildings every now and again.
Yeah, there are times for revolution
question, right?
rather than reform.
Right, yep. And I guess so. We've kind of spent a long time not fundamentally answering the question, like, are we brokenists? Do we think the fundamental institutions of American society are broken? I guess it seems to me that the answer from both of us is that's the wrong question. The right question is, how can you lift where you stand, right? How can you be the best person that you can be? But we still haven't answered the question of whether or not we think the fundamental institutions of society are broken. I guess, I don't know, and maybe, I'm not sure I do have the answer to that.
I'll throw out a guess. I'm going to be an optimist right now and say, no, I don't think it's all broken. I think that fundamentally, society is a one-generation thing. Every single generation has the option to drop it. And so as we're moving into the age where we get a chance to lift and are in the position to be the lifting force, as we're entering our 30s, my intention is to lift and to try to make this thing continue. And I have hope that it will succeed.
I have a preliminary answer as well, which is that. Okay, so the question is, are the institutions of society fundamentally broken? And I think my answer is that depends how we largely, mostly, not entirely, but mostly, on how we each behave. Similar to what you're saying, right? Every society is only one generation old in some sense, even though, you do carry stuff over from your predecessors, obviously. Right, but it's sustained or destroyed by whatever it is that you're doing now. So, not to be all cheesy, but it depends on us, I would assume, I think.
That is simultaneously encouraging and very heavy.
Yeah, it's not a comfortable, but I think I don't know. I think that, in the same way that children are often scared of responsibility, or intimidated by it, right? Like it's in part a mark of maturity to be willing to carry responsibility, right? I mean, maybe that's the defining feature of maturity, maybe, right? And I think that, I mean, similar to what you said with your student, right? You had experiences that student did not, and maybe that student has a reason to defer to you, and consider that carefully, whether or not there's not something that he's missing.
Yeah. In a very real sense, we're not equal because of the time. I see what he does. He does not see what I see, and that disparity is significant. If it was just he sees different than me, I mean that's equal to disagree. But by nature of the fact that I also was once 17, I do see what he sees. And I think politically we can use that to try to say, I'm not in a position to lecture you unless I understand where you're at too. And knowing both would choose mine. Mm-hmm. So anytime the political pundits and talking heads start by saying, I just can't understand how fill in the blank other side would do this thing.
I can stop listening to you now because
that statement is an admission that they don't have enough knowledge or information or moral standing to be able to make a pronouncement that's absolute.
Yeah. No, I deeply agree with that. I deeply agree with that. And it very much worries me whenever I hear someone say, I just don't understand. I mean, if it's an admission of ignorance in an effort to learn, it's phenomenal, right? But if I don't understand, therefore it's wrong, I'm just like, okay, so everybody who you don't understand is wrong. That's a great way to live your life. That's a great way to think about things. Sure. Wonderful. Amazing. Good luck with that. It's
good luck to everyone around you.
It's just such a fundamentally naive and arrogant statement, and naively arrogant statement, wrongfully arrogant statement that pushes one of my buttons for sure. Very little patience for that.
Absolutely.
It seems to me. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just about to make a pun because I just don't understand how someone could say that.
Well, I have said that.
Sorry, way to go meta. I certainly have.
So I feel like I can understand it a little bit. It seems to me, Joseph, that the position that we're describing slash espousing slash exploring here is very much compatible with being a brokenist. Like, it seems like we're saying, well, I don't know if we're brokenists or status quoists, but we think that the right response in either case is to be a tinkerist.
And the question is, what is broken, right? Because if, as you were saying, if the thing that is broken is out there, then I'm in a position to condemn it from the outside.
Mm-hmm.
But
or
if
only out there. Sorry, I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but at least to me, that's an
yes,
important clarification. Only.
yeah,
out
it is. It is a distinction. Only out there. And I think there's this idea in the New Testament. Jesus says, "Hey, one of you guys is corrupt and is going to betray me," and Peter and a number of the other apostles immediately responded and said, "Lord, is it I?"
Mm-hmm.
There's that humility to say, am I the weak link? Am I the one that's going to bring this whole thing down?
Or at
And
least
I think that is a really good place to start. When you're looking for the problems with society, I think that is the right place to start looking, not the place to stop, because there are problems outside of you. But if you did not start there, I am far less interested in your conclusions.
the right place to start, even if it's not the right place to stop. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I'm actually looking at the essay right now, the brokenism essay, and there's a phrase in it, broken beyond repair. And that I think is right. Beyond repair means I don't have to do anything to repair it because I can't. Right. And I don't know. That seems to me to be not the most productive way to address things. I do think here's the credit that I will give to the brokenist position for sure. I mean, you and I are not status quoists either. We could write a book about the problems that we think exist in society and politics and culture at all levels, right? From ourselves, through our families, to our communities, to our states, and all the way up to the whole world, right? But so we're not status quoists either, you and I don't think. But it seems to me that you and I would both acknowledge that there are plenty of broken institutions. Perhaps
including a few constitutional amendments that I'd like to see passed.
Yeah, I mean, there you go, right? Yeah, I don't know. It reminds me of Jordan Peterson's advice about arguments with your spouse, right? That like you need to be able to identify the problem at the right level of specificity, because otherwise, an argument about the dishes turns into you don't love me and we need to get divorced, right? And it's like, well, if it's possible to keep the problem more localized, that would be really nice, because then maybe there's a stain on the carpet, but maybe we can just replace the carpet or clean the carpet instead of running out the house and throwing a lit match behind us.